Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the Z mount 50mm 1.2 and we're going to be comparing that directly against the Z mount 50mm 1.8. Okay, so first things first, I know that these lenses are in completely different worlds when it comes to price point, but there are going to be some photographers who want to know which lens is better when it comes to sharpness, depth of field, out of focus rendering, and so on. So we're going to compare these lenses side by side. We're going to look at sharpness and different functions of these lenses, but keep in mind that the 50mm 1.2, because it's a 1.2, costs an awful lot more than the 50mm 1.8. And on the other hand, we already know that the Z mount 50mm 1.8 is one of the best 50mm prime lenses you can buy. That's something that's been mentioned a lot by a lot of other reviewers, a lot of other third-party reviews. So this comparison is to see, do you really need a 1.2, or is the 1.8 so good that actually the 51.2 is not something that you need? So we're going to compare these two lenses side by side. Now, as always, with all of my lens comparisons, I'm just going to show you the results. I'm going to put all the raw files into Lightroom. All of the shots have been taken on a Z7 II, so all the raw files will go from a Z7 II just straight into Lightroom. We're going to compare them side by side. No adjustments, no changes. They're both Nikon Z mount lenses. They're both native lenses, so we're just going to compare them side by side. So let's go take a look and see what differences we can see. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at some of these shots, and just one thing to keep in mind, every single one of these pictures has been taken on the same camera body. So that's all taken on a Z7 II. The only thing that's changed is the lens. The camera bodies remain the same, the raw settings and so on. And I've obviously then just imported them into Lightroom and I've not made any changes from there. We're just looking at these files. So first of all, on the left-hand side, we have the 50mm F1.8S wide open at f1.8. And on the right-hand side, we have the 50mm 1.2 wide open at 1.2. This is the comparison that we're going to do first, comparing both the lenses wide open to see what differences we can see in terms of sharpness and detail. This isn't really meant to be a difference in depth of field, but we'll be able to see some of those differences as well. I'll show you out of focus depth of field later on in the video. This is more just about kind of detail, foreground interest and so on. One thing that I'm going to state straight away to stop this video from being too long, we are going to look at these pictures straight away at 2:1 at 200%, because looking at them at 100%, there's no difference. So please excuse the fact that I'm going to jump straight to 200%. Just looking at this section here, this gives us a really good first insight into not only the level of sharpness in the foreground, but also the depth of field drop off between 1.8 and 1.2. The distance from this foreground to this background area here is maybe a centimeter at most. So that difference in depth of field is going to be quite significant, especially when you're dealing with quite close-up subjects or smaller subjects. So from a point of view of sharpness, let's get one thing very clear. The 50mm 1.8 is known for being incredibly sharp, wide open at 1.8. So the fact that from my first impressions, it looks to me like the 1.2, the 50mm 1.2 wide open at 1.2 is just as sharp and just as detailed as the 50mm 1.8 wide open at 1.8, which is insane. You know, older 1.2 lenses, when they were wide open at 1.2, in some cases you could struggle to actually get anything in focus because of how soft the actual area of focus was. To have a 1.2 lens that is this usable at 1.2 is pretty impressive. And I think there's two ways you can look at this straight away. You can either say to yourself, well, you know what, that 1.2 is amazing and I love the idea of 1.2, so I'm going to use a 1.2. Or this 1.8 is punching way above its weight and price point, and in terms of sharpness, it's just as good as a way more expensive 1.2 lens. And this really does hammer home how good some of those 1.8 lenses are. There's a lot of people who still talk about the Z mount 1.8 lenses not being good enough, and I don't know where that thought process comes from, because they are phenomenally good when it comes to picture quality. Almost identical here in terms of picture quality and detail between the two. I would really struggle to see a difference here, especially at the center of the frame. If we look at a few other objects in the scene, we can clearly see the difference in depth of field here between the two. Moving across to the left. Okay, let's take a look at this. So I feel like they're very similar. I'd be very hard pushed to choose between these two. Maybe a little bit more contrast, maybe a little bit more micro contrast here, which is making it seem like it's a little bit sharper. Maybe the 1.2 here just seems to be a little bit softer, just a little bit less contrasty between the white writing and the green board. I think maybe this is a little bit more detailed. Let's take a look at 300%. I mean, that makes it even harder to that makes it even harder to decide. So I'm unsure. But okay, so even away from the center, they're still so similar. And remember, this 1.2 is wide open at 1.2. Obviously, we can start to see that here we're still within the depth of field at 1.8, but here we are out of the 1.2 depth of field. So that's understandable. Here again, we can see the thickness of these lines affected by the difference between 1.8 and 1.2. The key thing to keep in mind is that because one of them is at 1.2 and one of them is at 1.8, the 1.2 lens is letting in a lot more light. So if you're talking about shooting handheld, obviously the 1.2 lens is going to be an advantage there. But in terms of sharpness and detail, there's no difference between them really. I'd be happy with either one of these. Wow, what a result. Now we have both lenses at 1.8. So the 50mm 1.8 was still there in the same aperture setting, wide open, and obviously the 50mm 1.2 is now stopped down to 1.8. And you obviously have to appreciate that when you stop a lens down, that can improve its sharpness, and I would definitely say that that has, especially to do with kind of micro contrast. I mean, the black here is a lot blacker. The edges between the white lines and the black background are much more significant. They're much sharper, they're much more precise. So stopping the 1.2 down to 1.8 really sharpens things up, really just controls the lens and gives us great results. But that's not taking away from the performance of that lens at 1.2. Now, as we start to look around the frame, we can just see that the 1.2 is now sharper because it's stopped down. Interestingly, there's still a little bit of difference in the depth of field. Checking down here in this bottom left-hand corner, and we can see that the 1.2 being stopped down, as you would expect, is just sharper now. It's still not massively significant, but it is definitely more contrasty and does have a lot more sharpness to it as well. There's no real sign of any chromatic aberrations that I can see either. There's no massive purple fringing or green fringing anywhere on any of these white lines or white edges. Everything seems to be controlled quite nicely. Maybe a tiny bit of purple fringing here, but very minimal. I think that's the same across both. Maybe a little bit of purple fringing here. Okay, so let's stop both of the lenses down, see if there's any differences then. Now we have both lenses stopped down to f2. So obviously that means that the 1.2 is stopped down by quite a few stops, whereas the 1.8 is only just stopped down. But it's always a good comparison to compare both these lenses at f2, because that might be the aperture that a lot of photographers shoot at if you don't want to shoot them wide open. Now at f2, again, we can see that the contrast and the sharpness of the 1.8 has improved slightly, but I still feel like the 1.2 is the stronger lens, and I feel like that is going to become the norm. Now, quite clearly, it's only just better, but let's not forget how good that 1.8 lens is. You know, if we were comparing this against an older 1.8 lens, or if we were comparing it against a 1.8 lens, then the situation would be different. Do keep in mind that we're not comparing a terrible lens against a really good lens here. We're comparing two incredibly good lenses side by side. It just so happens that one of them is a lot more expensive because it can go down to 1.2. So even at f2, the difference is very small, but I would say that the 1.2 looks the better shot. It's a little bit sharper, a little bit more contrasty, a little bit more controlled, a little bit more detail. I do feel like the 1.2 is the one that's kind of the standout. Again, especially here, I feel like the 1.8 hasn't really improved at all in any kind of contrast towards the edges. The 1.2 is much better, and right over on this corner of the frame, we can see that we are a lot more detailed and sharper here. Still a little bit soft, but it's significant compared to the 1.8. All right, well, let's stop them down even further and have a look then. Both lenses are now at f4, the 1.8 on the left and the 1.2 on the right hand side. Again, I still feel like the 1.2 has a little bit more contrast, has a little bit more punch to it, I think. The 1.8 though is very close behind. I mean, for enthusiasts, for depending on what you do in your photography, this difference, from a client's point of view, this difference is not going to be noticeable. But realistically, you know, you're not buying a 1.2 lens to stop it down to f4. You're buying a 1.2 lens to use it at 1.2, maybe at 1.4, maybe at 1.8. But the main advantage of a 1.2 lens is that 1.2 aperture. So seeing them in a very similar light at f4 just goes to show that, you know, a 51.8 can do a great job, just as good of a job as a 50mm 1.2 can when they're both stopped down to f4. Both are really nicely detailed, offer great sharpness. There's really not a lot in it. I think the 51.2 is a little bit sharper here towards the edges, so a little bit more edge sharpness might be important to you. Yeah, right towards the edges of the frame, the 51.2 is quite a bit sharper. So if you are often photographing things and you need detail and sharpness right towards the edges of the frame, that's where the 51.2 is going to be more useful over the 51.8. But at the center of the frame, they are very, very similar. They both handle colors and details very similar as well. There's no striking difference between them at the center of the frame. It's all about those edges and obviously the ability to shoot at 1.2. We'll compare it against this lens in the next video for those of you that spotted that, so keep an eye out for that. But let's stop them down now to f8 and have a final look at f8. Okay, so here we are at f8. We have the 1.8 on the left and the 1.2 on the right. Both stop down to f8, same shutter speed, and so on. And as you would expect, at f8, these lenses are identical. There's nothing really massively different between them at f8. There's no real difference no matter where we look in the middle of the frame when it comes to colors, contrast. Everything is very, very similar. It's really hard to tell between the two. I do think, however, though, that when we start to move towards the edges, so here, I think now they are finally identical here. But when we move to the very far edges, I do feel like the 1.2, the 50mm 1.2 is still a lot sharper and more detailed here in the corner of the frame than the 50mm 1.8 is. So if you are planning on using these lenses at f8 and corner sharpness is important to you, then the 1.2 is going to be better. So just to summarize what we've looked at there when it comes to picture quality, I feel like there's two sides to this story. Now you can either look at it the first way, which is that the 50mm 1.8 is so good and you're happy shooting at 1.8 that you don't need anything else. And that's fine. I think for a lot of photographers, the 50mm 1.8 is so good that you don't need anything else at that focal length, obviously. The other side of the story is that you know the advantages of shooting at 1.2 when it comes to exposure, when it comes to using a lower ISO, and when it comes to effectively, you know, being more creative with depth of field and so on. And you then know that you can shoot at 1.2 and still get incredibly good sharpness, detail that you just haven't been able to get from previous 1.2 lenses or even 1.4 lenses. Even Nikon f-mount 1.4 lenses weren't as sharp or as detailed as this when they're at 1.4. So it just goes to show that in some cases the 1.8 is going to be so good for a lot of photographers, but the 1.2 in the right hands and the picture quality it produces is going to be magical. It's going to produce some really great shots. The price difference indicates the difference between the lenses, the size and weight differences as well. And it's just a case of choosing which one's going to be the best for you. How often are you wanting to shoot at 1.2? If it's quite a lot, then the 1.2 makes sense and you'll still get that better picture quality. So what we're going to take a look at next is how they deal with depth of field, out of focus. I'm going to show you some example shots of those, and then a little bit about focus breathing. So here we have two shots taken on the same camera body. So again, both taken on a Z7 II. We have the 50mm 1.2 on the left at f1.2 and the 50mm 1.8 on the right at f1.8. This is going to be a look at their out of focusing area, so the depth of field, but it's also going to be a look at, just the other things that changes in the exposure. So one thing that's worth mentioning is the difference in ISO. So we can see that the 50mm 1.8 shot at 1.8 has to have an ISO of 5600. This was shot just using auto ISO. So auto ISO is chosen 5600, whereas when we look at the 1.2, because that's shot at 1.2, obviously letting in a lot more light, the auto ISO in that instance is chosen 2000 ISO. And that makes quite a big difference, especially on a Z7 II, where it's a higher megapixel count camera, so it is going to be prone to producing slightly more noise. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is when we zoom in here, and this is just at 100%. So even at 100%, we can see quite a significant change in the level of noise and grain in the shot. Now, personally, I don't think that this level of noise and grain is a problem. Some people might quite like it from an artistic point of view. It's also very easy to remove. Noise and grain is one of the easiest things to remove when it comes to editing your images, whether it's in Lightroom, Capture One, Photoshop, whatever it is you use to edit. Removal of noise is not difficult anymore, so this level of noise is not an issue really. But if you are after the cleanest, least amount of grain in your images, then a 1.2 lens is always going to be an advantage there, because it allows you to take more light in using your aperture rather than you using your ISO. We can quite clearly see the difference in the level of noise. When it actually comes to the depth of field, when it actually comes to the out of focus areas in the frame, we can just see that 1.2 is just smoothing everything out. I feel like the 1.8 is still really nice, and especially when we're looking at the whole picture, it's not super easy to see massive differences. But when we start zooming in and looking at 100% or at 1:1, we can see that the 1.2 is just a lot smoother, and it's not as easy for you to recognize things in the background. So this yellow strip here is a handrail, and that just kind of blurs into nothingness at 1.2, whereas in 1.8 it's kind of recognizable. And it's just not quite as smooth as it is in the 1.2. So if we look at the top of the frame up here as well, this is strips of wire that are attached to the top of this metal cage. And we can see that we get the lines of that strips of wire still within the 1.8 lens, but at 1.2 they just start to merge into one. So again, they're just not as distracting in this shot. Again here, just not as impactful as they are in that 1.8. So we're just seeing that the bits of wire are merging together in the 1.2 lens. Both of them control highlights really well. There's no severe chromatic aberration. There's no real purple fringing going on or color fringing going on. Maybe a little tint of green. So I think that transition from foreground to background is just much smoother. There's much more of a pop, whereas the depth of field still looks really nice, and I think that's still gonna be good enough for most people, but it's just a little bit rough. It's not as smooth as you'd get from the 1.2 lens, and that's what we would expect. That's the kind of level that we would expect. If you want to see more examples or shots taken in the day with the 50mm 1.2, then check out my first 50mm 1.2 video. I put a lot of examples in that video, so do check that out. I'll put that in the card in the top right hand corner. Right, well, I hope that you found this look at the 50mm 1.2 versus the 50mm 1.8 useful. If you have any questions or if there's anything else you want me to test about these lenses, then let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.